Good evening. I'm John Bailey. This is People to be Heard, the program where people who have something to say have their say. Tonight, you've got front yard garden pioneers. David Abbott on my far left and Seamus McGovern in the center here of White Plains, New York, USA. And tonight, they are here because they talked to me about something very unique, and that is the concept of the front yard gardening. Welcome to the program, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Right. Now, David, you came up with sort of like the front yard garden idea for your home. How did you get interested in that? What was the organic epiphany that you had?
It was probably a number of them, but
Yes.
it started with the idea that my front yard was kind of boring and standard. It had circles and squares and hedges and grass, and I thought I could do better. And so I drove around looking for ideas, and I kept seeing the same thing over and over and over again in other houses. And so I started to think I need to start over. Get rid of some of the hedges, get rid of some of the standard plants like rhododendron, which are fine, they're beautiful, but I wanted to do more variety. And so I started taking things out and putting new plants in, new perennial garden beds, a place for me to sit where I could watch everything, and it kind of evolved from there. Eventually, where today I've gotten rid of almost all the grass in my front yard, and I have vegetable gardens and perennial beds.
Yes. Can we take a look at some of those slides?
Sure.
Sure.
I think up right now is the way my yard looked at the beginning, with a nice rabbit in the middle of the yard. And as I said, I had nothing wrong with that, but it was kind of standard, and to me it was a little boring. First I put in a perennial bed. This was last year. It's still a lot has to be filled in. This was only the first year, but those are lupin plants, and wanted to do more. As the summer progressed, the lupins, and I had other perennials coming in with different flowers, different colors, different textures throughout the summer. And at this point, the grass is still there, but this is midsummer, and again, it's only in the first year. This year, it's already looking like it's filled in quite a bit more than that. And I just found it to be much more interesting than just sort of the textures of green that were there before. Then
you expanded.
Eventually, I took all the grass out. As you can see, it looks kind of brown at this point. But I put in this was last August, so it was very at the end of the season, and I eventually put in. This shows the walkway that were in the sitting area, and put in a raised bed so that we could have a herb garden and lettuces, which grew in, and even by last fall I had a crop of green beans and lettuces and spinaches, all in the front yard.
Really, and you, Seamus, you were telling me that this is without fertilizer, right?
It's all natural. I've really concluded that my grass, after decades and decades of people putting down chemicals, myself included, was essentially dead. It wouldn't grow anything. And so I just cut out all the chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and so on, and dumped a couple of truckloads of compost into it, mixed it in, and now it's going to be 100% organic and no added chemicals.
Yeah. Now, we were talking, Seamus, that this is sort of that David had gotten into the idea of putting more diversity into your personal individual environment.
Yes.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
When we were originally looking at the front yard, you had grass, you had taxus, you had the rhododendron, azalea. It was all sort of the same sort of thing that you find house to house to house. And what we began to do was just try to think about what we could change in order to make it more beautiful or different. And as you saw in that one image there, we kind of started with the lupin was the beginning of that.
And David, you're really a big proponent of changing the environment in a home. Could you expand on your thoughts there?
Yes. Well, when you own a home and you have a yard,
Yeah.
you have to be making choices. Whether your choice is just to have a grass lawn or to do something like what I've done, you're making choices. And I think that people aren't maybe aware of what those choices are, and they just default to the grass lawn and a couple of standard hedges and shrubs and so on. I think that there's a lot to be said for a landscape, an urban or suburban landscape, where you drive down the street, instead of just seeing lawn after lawn after lawn, you start to see different textures, different colors, different greens, different browns, reds, purples, pinks, at different heights and so on. I think that would be a much more interesting landscape. And so people don't have to go all the way to the extreme. I mean, I'm not advocating that anything that people have to do at all, but I think that to me, it would be a much more interesting landscape if you as you drive down the street, you see more than just one lawn after another, which are generally not being used. The only time most lawns get used is when people are mowing them.
Yes.
And instead,
catch maybe.
And instead, start to see some of this variety. I think it would just be more interesting. I find it more interesting, and it gets me out of the house. I sit in my front yard. Neighbors come by. We talk about my garden. I'm meeting people that I never knew before. I would have never gone and sat in my front yard if it was just a bunch of grass.
Now, Seamus, you have a great little personal story about our third guest on the program, green cabbage, which is a living plant. Tell us the story behind it.
Well, the story goes like this. We were thinking of this idea of a front yard garden, and right on Prospect. My brother lives on Prospect, and I was speaking with his wife and explaining to her how easy it would be to put a front yard garden in. Right across the street from her house is our community garden. And so while we were talking, her grandson was there, Brendan, and he just sort of didn't say much, just was listening to the conversation. And then about 2.5 months later, I get this call, oh, you have to come over and take a look at what Brendan has done. So he, from hearing the story of possibly putting a front yard garden at her house, he said, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to grow this. And for me, this is a sort of gentle approach to planting a seed and then having it grow, and thus this is what we have here.
Introducing a child, unbeknownst to you, that it really impressed them. You never can tell what will, galvanize the mind of a young person. And they can actually help with the garden too.
Oh yeah, and this is the thing that in terms of planting a seed, it's this idea of front yard gardens. It's like planting a seed. Somebody's not so sure that they want to do that. It's too much work. But at the end of the day, I really feel as though there's a lot more pleasure involved in taking care of a small garden than there is with just looking at your lawn.
Right. Now you can also, we're not just talking about flowers here, but you are growing your own food in your front yard.
Yes. And now backyard as well.
Backyard too.
No grass anywhere.
And your garden is really elaborate. Now, is there a way a struggling family can save on food costs by planting these gardens?
Absolutely, absolutely. You have to. I mean, you can spend a lot of money if you want, but you don't need to. You could just put in a tomato plant, and I can promise you, by August, I mean, you can still do it. It's not too late. You can put a tomato plant in this week, next week. By August, you will have tomatoes that you could never get in the grocery store, that will taste so much better that it will change your life, these tomatoes.
Why
just
do they
one
taste
tomato.
better?
Well, they're fresh, first of all. I mean, you go outside and pick them, and you bring them into your dining room, and they're actually still alive. Tomatoes in the grocery store were picked a week before. They've all been bred to be transported properly and look good in the store, but they've not been bred for taste. If you go to, if any tomato plant you get and you put in will taste 1,000% better, and that's a good start all by itself. But you can do more. I mean, Department of Agriculture estimates that a $70 investment in a garden will produce $600 worth of produce by the end of the year.
Right.
And so
what size garden?
that would be roughly 600 square feet.
600 square feet, which would help me on the math here. 600 square feet, that's
20 by 30.
20 by 30. Okay,
Right.
very good. I can't do that. Can the fruits of the garden be preserved for the winter?
Absolutely. And that does require more work,
Yeah.
although an awful lot can be done in just your freezer. If you have extra freezer space, you can, beans, tomatoes, squash, potatoes, all can be frozen. Just
Can freeze them? I never knew that.
absolutely. I mean, you just
Wow.
put them in a vacuum bag and mark the date on it and put it in your freezer. It helps to blanch them, but you can do a lot just by that. Now there are people who will can and make sauces and things like that,
Which is a whole nother thing.
and that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But if it's also, it can be part of your it could be part of your stick. I mean, you can get your kids involved with it. I haven't done that yet. I'm planning on it. I don't want to sell something I haven't done, but it certainly can be done if you want to preserve. But for me, the idea is throughout the summer, I want to be growing things that I can just go out in the garden, pick up, take inside, and make food, make my dinner with it. And without having to go to the store.
Fresh herbs and fresh lettuce right out of the garden.
It's all still
I've
alive.
Ever had.
Yeah.
Yes. So now, can you preserve the seeds from your plants that you grow?
Yes, and that's a good way to save on cost. First of all, planting from seeds, like tomato plants, if you go to a big box store or hardware store or nursery, you're going to probably spend over $10 for a small plant to put in the ground. You can buy a package of seeds and have 30 plants from that package of seeds for the cost of like $3. So first of all, seeds are a great way to save the cost overall.
Right.
But when you save seeds, it's free from year in, year out. But there are certain types of plants that you can save seeds from, and certain others you
So
cannot.
you have to replant these vegetables every year, don't you?
Yes.
Yes,
The vegetables.
Those are what are known as annuals.
Yes,
Right?
annuals you have to plant every year, like beans and corn,
Yeah.
tomatoes.
And perennials always come back.
They come back. Most of my flowers are perennials, but I have a fruit garden in the back which are perennials. So it's raspberries, strawberries, rhubarb,
Wow.
and those will come back every year. I don't have to do anything there.
Where does this green thumb come from? Does it have a particular talent? Or
No, not really. My father was a big gardener, so I was
I see.
introduced to it with him. He turned the entire backyard into a vegetable garden when my mother was asking for a swimming pool. So that was his way of dealing with that. But I was not. It wasn't a big thing for me
I see.
when I was a kid.
Your father was. Don't you wish your father were alive today?
I
Or
wish
is
he
it-
were.
Yes,
he kept
and you
bees.
he'd be so tickled pink.
He kept bees. He had all kinds of strange plants. I mean, one of the things I like about the gardening is I'm growing things I can't get at a grocery store. I'm growing this year green beans that are a yard long, melons that you can just pick up and eat like an apple. All kinds of things that just aren't available in the grocery store. What's available in the grocery store is fairly limited. It's kind of like what got me into my front yard garden in the first place. It's a very limited selection, and I wanted more than that, more interesting things.
More interesting. Seamus, you got started and introduced to community gardens when you lived in France. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah,
The
that's
gardens.
exactly.
Yeah.
I was living in France because my kids live in France, sort of a divorce situation. I moved over there for about 5 or 6 years. I was looking for a garden because I was living in an apartment. I didn't have a place to have a garden. I myself was also kind of inspired by my father, especially about tomatoes. But I had a community garden for 3 years in France, and they're very active. really stressing organic, natural growing. And one thing I can say is that in France, they're sort of a little bit ahead of us in terms of, or I should say very ahead of us in terms of recycling and these sorts of things. So I got my feet wet there. And then I came back to New York and luckily found this community garden next to the St. Bartholomew's.
Now, is community garden, our community garden, well, let's put it this way, our front yard gardens getting very popular across the country and in White Plains, are they?
I would say the idea of putting a vegetable garden in your front yard is not caught on exactly,
Not caught on, exactly.
throughout the country. But the idea of not relying on grass lawns is taking hold in many parts of the country, particularly in the West where water is a big, big resources are tight. It's estimated that over 30% of our domestic water use is put into lawns, over 30%. A lot of places in the country that's not sustainable. It's not a big problem here in New York, but even so, people are looking for alternatives, I think.
And the water rates keep going up and up, so that will save you money, particularly in the city of White Plains, New York, USA.
And if you're going to have grass, for instance, it has to be maintained, it has to be mowed, it has, have chemicals. It's almost inevitable that people are going to put chemicals down. And I think people are looking for alternatives. You see a lot more perennial gardens going in front yards at the very least. I think taking it the next step to putting a vegetable garden in is something that people haven't necessarily thought about doing. And it was a big moment for me last August when I did it. I said, do I really want to take all this grass out and put a garden in the front yard? And we moved ahead, and I'm very happy with it.
Right. Well, it certainly has taken hold terrifically when you say without fertilizer. That's amazing. You always get this, of course, the seeds that I threw down on my front yard to fill in some grass patches aren't really growing that well, so maybe my soils weren't.
The soil's probably dead. I mean, soil is a living
Could
organism itself with bacteria and fungus and things in it. And every time you put chemicals down, you're killing that organism, and you're left with just a bunch of clay and sand at the end of it all with a lot of chemicals. And that's not enough to really have a healthy yard.
Okay, so when I did have a garden in my backyard over on Merritt Avenue many years ago, I lost a number of plants to the squash hole borer, a very common pest. Now, how do you preserve the fruits of your labor from critters like rabbits, various other pests, without using chemicals or whatever sprays?
Well, I think the first principle is you have to accept that a certain amount of what you do is going to get taken.
I see.
I mean, it's okay. You give nature back what it's due, and that's okay. I mean, if I lose a few fruit, fine. I'm not at all bothered by that. The second thing is that if your plants are healthy, if they're growing in good, strong, healthy soil, and they're not being poisoned, they're going to have their own defenses against most pests and things. They're going to do just fine. Again, you may lose some things, but by and large, you're going to do fine. The healthier the plant is, the more it is able to deal with, regenerate, or just deal with the pest outright on its own. But if you do have some infestation, something going on that is a serious problem, I don't have all the answers to that, believe me, but I can tell you, you can go on the internet in one short evening and find YouTube videos or find information on exactly what it is that's happening, and there will be information there on natural solutions to those problems rather than just putting down chemicals.
Okay. So go ahead.
There's another thing that we ran into, and when you have a lawn, most of the gardeners now are putting down chemicals that inhibit any other weed growth. So they want just your lawn to grow. So when we actually dug up the lawn, it was difficult to get some of the new stuff to grow because of the fact that there was still those trace chemicals. and then we amend the soil with compost, and that seems to have gone away. So
There's a transition.
one of the things is that when you're using pesticides, it's killing certain insects, but promoting other. There's an imbalance. So when you have a healthy garden, the plants are stronger to protect themselves.
Okay, now where do you get the right seeds to plant? You brought some catalogs with you, and could you explain this phenomena called heirloom seeds?
Sure.
Yeah.
We talked before about some seeds you can save and some seeds you can't. There's a basic division in the types of seeds and plants you're going to find in seed catalogs and in nurseries and hardware stores, wherever you buy your seeds. They're either hybrids or they're open pollinated. Hybrid means that it's just a cross. It's a first generation cross. And they're great plants. There's nothing wrong with a hybrid. Like if you want to get a start on a tomato plant, go get a big boy tomato. It's a hybrid. It's vigorous. It's strong. It's healthy. It'll give you great fruit. But you can't save those seeds. If you try to plant those seeds,
Hybrid.
if you try to plant a hybrid seed the next year, it will grow, but it won't be the same variety. It'll look different. It won't have the same characteristics.
A mutation.
Well, it's not. It's like a
lack of
designer
better
dogs. It's like a labradoodle.
I see.
If you breed two labradoodles, you don't necessarily get the same labradoodle. But if you take a Labrador and a poodle, you get a labradoodle.
Yeah.
The hybrid seeds are like that. You can't save those seeds. You can, but it won't give you an appropriate product next year of what you're looking for. If you go to what's called open pollinated seeds, though, those are seeds that are stable generation to generation to generation. They will always produce roughly the same plant every year. And then the next step beyond that are heirloom seeds, which are open pollinated seeds that have been around for many decades, have been passed down generation to generation from grandmother to mother to daughter or son or whatever. And they're old school varieties that have been around for 50, 100 years. There are seed catalogs and seed companies out there that make it a point to try to preserve those old varieties and make them available. The whole seed catalog is one. It's a Missouri company. You can find in here just crazy things that you can't find anywhere else. They're reasonable. It's a mail order operation, though they have a store up in Hartford where you can buy them. The Seed Saver Exchange is a foundation devoted to the idea of just preserving seed varieties, the diversity of seed varieties. They will seek out and find things that no one else has found, or it's been growing in somebody's backyard for a century, and then they'll grow out an inventory of it and make it available.
All right. So Seamus, I want to start a garden. What do I first do, and how much work is involved?
Well, the first thing you do is kind of decide where you want to place it in your yard. And if it's someplace that there's grass, we're going to take up the grass. And that's basically the beginning of it, taking up the grass and then bringing in some compost and some peat moss and amending the soil.
I see. So you have to make some investment in soil.
You don't necessarily have to. You can take the grass right up and just weed it. That's the way that we do it at the community garden. So adding compost in this just is going to be helping. But in most cases, you could go right with the lawn, just take up the lawn.
How much can you plant to begin with? What kind of mix do you recommend?
I would recommend starting easy. I mean, things like squashes will produce a huge amount of, like summer squash and zucchini and things like that. Very easy to grow. You don't really have to do anything other than every so often look down there and pull a squash up and take it in and cook it. Tomatoes are very easy and great dividends. I saw the pictures I put in, a crop of green beans. You can do pole beans, bush beans. I've been expanding into other things. So I recommend putting lettuces in a cool area, a somewhat shaded area. They don't like the heat. And I like lettuce and spinach because it's something, again, you can just walk out of the house, cut some, go inside and make a salad. You don't have to always have a bunch of lettuce sitting in your refrigerator, which is going bad. Herbs are very easy. I would really recommend just getting a hold of a seed catalog and looking and see what's interesting.
Well, gentlemen, David Abbott and Seamus McGovern have been talking with us about the idea of making your front yard a garden that will produce food for you. And you haven't received any negative about changing your yard?
No, I was worried about that.
Yes,
like, is somebody going to come by and say, "Wait a minute, you can't do this"?
Wait, yes.
And
the quality of life, please.
Everybody who's, I sit in my front yard. One of the things I would suggest about placement is place it where you're going to want to sit and watch it.
Yeah.
But I sit there, and people come by every evening, and we talk about the garden, we talk about what's growing. They're interested in it. I've never had anybody come by with anything other than really positive feedback.
Well, there's just something about seeing something growing on its own, like the green cabbage on the table here, for example. I mean, that is alive. It's well. Plants have great spirit. They come back, and I've always admired that, how grass will pop up through a walk. You know, and this is it's a grand experience. Now, where do you go if you want to start?
For information?
Yeah.
It's amazing what's online.
Yeah.
But I really recommend getting a good quality seed catalog, like the ones I have here,
Yeah, okay.
and perusing it and just letting your imagination run, and then sit out in your yard, wherever you think it might go, and find your place where you want to sit first.
Okay.
And once you have that, let it start to form in your mind.
Right. Well, David Abbott, Seamus McGovern, pioneers in front yard gardens, you have been heard. Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
John Bailey, good night for People to be Heard.